The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, rotting leaves, and the faint tang of something older, something that had seeped into the very soil of the Louisiana bayou over centuries. Thomas Whitmore's boots sank slightly into the soft, marshy ground with each step, leaving irregular impressions that the swamp would swallow before nightfall. The fog hung low, curling around the cypress trees like ghostly fingers, blotting out the distant shapes of the river and the twisted, gnarled roots that emerged from the murky, water-like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. In that silence, the swamp spoke in whispers, not the ordinary croak of frogs or the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface, but a subtle, deliberate, almost human rhythm that made every nerve in Thomas's body tighten. He adjusted the strap of his lantern and glanced at Marie Beaumont walking beside him. She moved with a cautious grace, alert to every sound, every shift in the fog. Her eyes, dark and luminous, scanned the bayou like twin searchlights, reflecting both fear and resolve. The memory of Samuel Beaumont's warnings replayed in Thomas's mind. The swamp is patient, and it remembers. They had arrived just as the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting a sickly orange glow over the stagnant water. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and Thomas could swear the blackened trunks of the cypress trees shifted. When he wasn't looking, he thought of the Ravencrest Mansion, or rather, what remained of it, a place long abandoned, left to decay under the relentless Louisiana sun and storm. No human presence had touched it for decades, yet stories persisted, whispered in nearby towns, tales of screams that cut through the night, of lights flickering in windows where no one lived, of shapes that moved beneath the floors and walls. Thomas had not believed all of it, not entirely. But the journals, the skeletal remains, the waterlogged tools of unspeakable experimentation they had found last summer, those had altered his perspective irrevocably. The truth, it seemed, was always more grotesque than folklore. And now, standing at the edge of the bayou clearing that had once been the Ravencrest estate, he felt the weight of expectation settle on him, pressing his shoulders into the mist. Marie stopped abruptly, her hand tightening on his arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, though her voice carried over the swamp as if daring it to answer. Thomas froze, straining to discern the sound. A faint gurgling, soft at first, then swelling into a steady, rhythmic slosh. The water along the banks of the creek shivered, as if something enormous moved beneath it. The same sensation Thomas had felt the last time he descended into that cursed mansion's basement. The water responding to something unseen, something alive in its depths. He nodded, swallowing the lump of unease in his throat. "Yes, it's here," he said. His voice was low, almost reverential, a recognition of forces beyond understanding. They pressed on cautiously, each step deliberate, boots squelching in mud, lanterns casting trembling circles of light onto the dark water. The clearing ahead opened up, revealing the charred foundation stones that had survived the fire, blackened and jagged, half sunken into the earth. Even from this distance, Thomas could see the faint shimmer of water pooled between the stones, reflecting the fog and the last light of dusk. He approached the edge of the ruins and knelt to inspect the soil. The salt from the bishop's ritual had penetrated the earth deeply, yet the swamp's natural resilience was evident. Small sprouts of wild flora had begun reclaiming the land, bright green shoots defying the poisoned ground, signaling life where only death had once dwelled. Yet beneath this surface growth, the darkness lingered, a subtle, persistent vibration that Thomas could feel in his bones. He rose slowly, lantern held aloft, scanning the perimeter. "This land has healed on the surface," he murmured, "but it's still listening, still remembering." Marie stepped beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked, eyes fixed on the faint ripples in the water. "They always come," Thomas replied. His gaze drifted toward the pool that had once been the mansion's basement. Now nothing more than a depression filled with stagnant water. Yet he could almost see the outlines, the shapes that had risen from that watery abyss months ago. Samuel, the 6 others, their forms distorted by Cornelius Ravenrest's unspeakable experiments, now finally freed from their earthly torment. He remembered the intensity in Samuel's eyes as he had spoken of vengeance tempered by justice, of suffering endured and finally release. A sudden splash broke his reverie. The water trembled violently, and the air seemed to tighten, constricting around them. Thomas swung his lantern toward the movement, heart pounding. Ripples expanded across the surface in concentric waves, as if something enormous moved just beneath, testing the boundary between reality and nightmare. Marie gasped, clutching his arm. He tightened his grip around hers in return, grounding them both. Then came the shapes, 7 of them, rising from the water like specters made flesh. They were luminous yet muted, their bodies barely perceptible in the fog. But Thomas recognized them immediately, the victims of Cornelius Ravencrest's atrocities freed at last. Their forms restored but carrying the weight of memories, too harrowing to ever fully vanish. Their eyes, once hollowed by pain, now glimmered with a faint hope, a solemn gratitude. They hovered above the blackened foundation, ethereal yet solid, acknowledging the couple with subtle nods. Thomas felt a wave of relief, almost spiritual, wash over him. "They've come for peace," he whispered, voice trembling. The seven forms lingered for a heartbeat, then drifted higher into the mist, dissolving into the twilight as if returning to some place beyond mortal comprehension. The swamp fell silent once more, the water still, the fog curling back around the cypress like a protective shroud. Marie exhaled slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "It's over." "Finally," she said, her voice a mixture of sorrow and wonder. Thomas nodded, but deep down he knew it was not entirely over. The documents, the letters, the fragments of his great-grandfather's research, they remained. And the possibility that other sites, other laboratories, other victims existed lingered like a shadow behind. Every triumph, he knelt beside the ruined foundation, placing a hand on the soil. The ground was warm, alive, pulsating with the slow rhythm of nature reclaiming its territory. He could feel the life returning, stubborn and unrelenting. "Life is stronger than death," he murmured. "Goodness is stronger than evil." Marie placed her hand over his. Together they surveyed the clearing, where wildflowers now bloomed in defiance of history, painting the scars of atrocity with vibrant color. As dusk deepened into night, Thomas knew the path ahead would be long, arduous, and filled with shadows he could not yet perceive. Yet for the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of hope, of purpose, of a legacy not defined by the sins of the past, but by the light he and Marie could choose to bring into the world. The bayou whispered around them, a living witness to the events that had unfolded, echoing with secrets and memories, both human and inhuman. Thomas lit a small lantern and placed it on one of the remaining foundation stones, a symbolic beacon not for the dead but for the living, a promise that darkness would not have the final word. And in the distance, through the mist and the branches of the cypress, a faint glimmer appeared, perhaps fireflies, perhaps the lingering echoes of souls set free, dancing briefly before vanishing into the night. Thomas and Marie remained in silence, bearing witness to the renewal of a place once consumed by evil. They understood now, as they never had before, that while darkness could linger, it could never fully endure where life and light persisted. The morning sun fell weakly through the thick canopy of oaks, surrounding Boston's Charles River, pale light refracted by the mist rolling off the water. Thomas Whitmore sat in his cluttered study, the air heavy with the scent of aged paper, ink, and the faint trace of tobacco, from decades of use by the previous occupant of the room. The walls were lined with tall oak bookcases, stuffed haphazardly with journals, ledgers, and thick volumes bound in cracked leather. On his desk lay a collection of documents, maps and letters, some yellowed with age, others still crisp and fragile, fragments of a history Thomas had never fully known. The secret lineage of his family's dark obsession now laid bare before him. Marie Beaumont leaned over the desk, examining a letter addressed in precise, careful handwriting. It bore the mark of Bishop Marcel Fontaine and had been delivered personally by Father Antoine Rousseau. Thomas unfolded it. Carefully, the parchment crackling softly under his fingers. The letter's content was precise, formal, and yet tinged with urgency. It described reports collected over decades by the Church, detailing instances of human experimentation across the northeastern United States, and linked these atrocities to Thomas's great-grandfather, a man whose name had been whispered with both reverence and fear within certain academic circles. "This is worse than I imagined," Marie said softly, eyes scanning the text. "I knew Cornelius Ravencrest was your uncle, but I didn't realize the research spanned generations, centuries even." Thomas rubbed his eyes, pressing his fingers against the bridge of his nose. "It's not just generations. It's a network, a lineage of obsession. Letters indicate that my great-grandfather, Ambrose Whitmore, corresponded with men and women across New England, researchers with the same ambitions, the same disregard for human life, experiments designed to push the human body beyond its natural limits, to play God." His voice faltered slightly as he read aloud portions of the documents. Notes on chemical compounds intended to manipulate cellular structures. Journals detailing the abduction of impoverished laborers under the guise of employment, and sketches. Horrifying. Anatomical studies, that suggested a mind unrestrained by morality. Marie traced the letters with her finger, her knuckles white against the brittle parchment. We knew Ravencrest was twisted, but I didn't realize he inherited this philosophy. It's like a disease carried through the blood. Thomas nodded grimly. Yes, and it didn't die with him. The letters mentioned successors, apprentices, even distant relatives. Some of these researchers vanished without trace, but their laboratories, their victims, those remain hidden in plain sight or buried in secrecy. It's my responsibility to find them. He spread a map across the desk, carefully marking locations described in the letters and reports. Vermont, upstate New York, parts of Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, areas where industrial mills, sanitariums and private estates had served as fronts for human experimentation. Look here, he said, pointing to a small red circle on the map. An abandoned mill in Vermont. Circa 1812. Irish immigrants were promised work, but records indicate they were taken inside and never seen again. Witness testimonies from families decades later hint at medical experiments, chemical treatments, confinement, and deformation, remarkably similar to what Cornelius did in Louisiana. Marie's lips pressed into a thin line. So Ravencrest was not the beginning. He was just the culmination of this. Thomas's gaze darkened. Yes, a culmination, and perhaps the most violent expression of an ideology passed down from the Whitmore lineage. But these documents suggest a troubling possibility. There could be other, less obvious sites. Laboratories disguised as mental health institutions, orphanages, even research facilities attached to universities. Places where victims were never recorded, never memorialized. People who suffered disappeared into history with no one left to remember them. For hours, they pored over the documents, transcribing letters, matching dates, cross-referencing locations with census data, property records, and old parish registries. The patterns were chilling. Where one Whitmore had initiated research, a network of correspondence continued it elsewhere. Names appeared and disappeared in seemingly innocuous correspondence, scientific titles, invitations to lectures and peer-reviewed publications, all concealing the grotesque human cost behind formulas and experimental diagrams. By mid-afternoon, Thomas paused to lean back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. It's one thing to see what Ravencrest did in Louisiana, but this is industrial in scale. Decades of cruelty, hidden behind polite society and academic respectability. And it's all connected to our bloodline. Marie placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. You're not alone in this. We'll uncover the truth together. And the victims? They deserve it, every single one. Thomas exhaled and nodded. We begin with the Vermont mill, and then we follow the trail. 3 weeks later, Thomas and Marie arrived in a remote part of Vermont, the snow of late winter melting into slushy mud along winding country roads. The mill was nothing more than a crumbling structure, blackened timber and rusted machinery, standing as a testament to both human ambition and neglect. Local legends spoke of missing workers and a sense of unease that had kept the townsfolk from exploring the ruins for generations. Thomas led the way through the mill, careful to step over rotten planks and tangled undergrowth. Each room was an echo of history, faded graffiti, rusted barrels once used to store chemicals, and remnants of machinery designed for textile production, now warped and silent. He crouched to examine a pile of yellowed papers in the corner, discovering a ledger detailing names, dates, and experimental procedures. Each entry carried a weight, a subtle hint of suffering. Patient 27, subject shows resistance. Increased compound dosage, confinement extended. Patient 31, marked tissue necrosis. Recalibrate restraints. Note behavioral deviation. Marie's hand hovered over the papers as though fearing to touch the horrors recorded. They weren't even trying to hide it here, she said quietly. They left evidence behind, knowing no one would see it. Thomas continued through the mill, uncovering makeshift cages, jars filled with preserved specimens, and handwritten notes, detailing chemical experiments that mirrored those conducted by Ravencrest decades. Later, it was a grim revelation. The Whitmore obsession had begun long before Cornelius, and the patterns were tragically consistent. Experimentation, suffering, dehumanization, and meticulous documentation. At sunset, they found what appeared to be a hidden basement, the entrance masked by a stack of broken crates. Thomas pried open the door, revealing a subterranean chamber, small and windowless, with water pooled on the floor and the scent of mildew heavy in the air. While the room was empty, the echoes of past screams seemed to cling to the walls. He could almost feel the presence of the victims, their suffering vibrating faintly through the air. Marie whispered, "We need to document everything, every detail, every object. These people, they deserve to be remembered." Thomas nodded solemnly, taking out his camera and recording equipment. And we will. They will not be forgotten. Every site we uncover, every victim identified, their stories will be told. That is our duty. They spent several days meticulously cataloging the Vermont mill, mapping the rooms, photographing artifacts, transcribing surviving journals. Thomas felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, yet he also felt a sense of purpose he had never known. Each piece of evidence was a testament to human cruelty, but also to his ability, and Marie's, to illuminate that darkness and offer some measure of justice. Next on their list was a sanitarium in upstate New York, operational from 1825 to 1840, which had served as a front for medical experimentation. The building, once a stately Victorian manor, had been abandoned for decades. Its boarded windows stared like empty eyes and the gates were rusted shut. Local legend described strange lights at night and the occasional disappearance of children or travelers who had ventured too close. Inside, Thomas discovered an organized laboratory hidden behind the main infirmary. Shelves held jars of chemicals, some still intact, and cabinets contained handwritten notes detailing psychological experiments, chemical testing, and surgical procedures on unwilling patients. The methods were more sophisticated than Ravencrest's crude brutality, a scientific veneer applied to horrors of equal magnitude. Marie found a small collection of journals tucked into a false compartment within the wall. The entries described the subjects' lives before capture, their families, and their eventual fates. The contrast between meticulous record-keeping and utter moral depravity was staggering. One page read, Patient 14 exhibits heightened fear response. Administer sedative mixture. Observe neurological impact. Consent unnecessary. Survival irrelevant. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a movement. A methodical philosophy of control and transformation. And it all connects back to my family in ways I'm only beginning to understand. They documented every detail, taking care to preserve fragile evidence, while ensuring that it could be used in historical records, potential investigations or memorials for victims. The process was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, as the weight of human suffering accumulated like a fog around them. Yet with every discovery, Thomas felt a growing resolve. The legacy of darkness would not continue unchallenged. By the end of Section 2, Thomas and Marie had uncovered multiple historical sites, each revealing more about the Whitmore lineage and the widespread nature of their cruel experiments. Their investigation set the stage for a deeper understanding of the network of human suffering and laid the foundation for the later formation of the Covenant of Witnesses. The night had fallen over Vermont like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The abandoned mill, once a place of industry and promise, now loomed like a monument to cruelty, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the pale winter moon. Thomas Whitmore and Marie Beaumont approached cautiously, their boots crunching on frost-hardened mud and scattered debris. The bitter wind carried with it the faintest trace of decay and chemical tang, the lingering residue of human suffering preserved in the very air. They carried lanterns and recording equipment, prepared to document every detail of the forgotten horrors within. Yet neither of them felt entirely ready for what they might encounter. The further they ventured toward the mill, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the building itself remembered the pain that had occurred within its walls and resented the intrusion of living observers. "Do you feel that?" Marie whispered, stopping mid-step. Her breath condensed in front of her face in a small cloud. "It's like the air itself is thick, heavy, watching us." Thomas nodded, adjusting his lantern. "It's more than just cold. It's expectation. The building knows we're here, and whatever echoes of the past remain, they're aware." The front door, long warped and cracked, resisted their efforts to open it. Thomas pried it slowly, each creak echoing like a scream through the empty interior. They stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the lantern light, and the stale air was pungent with mildew, rust, and faint chemical odors. The main floor was cluttered with the detritus of industrial decay. Broken looms, rusted cogs, shattered glass, and fragments of machinery that once promised livelihood, but had instead facilitated atrocity. Marie's eyes caught something on the floor, a smear of darkened residue, almost fluid in appearance yet still frozen in the icy air. She knelt, brushing a finger over it. The substance was sticky and foul, like coagulated oil mixed with rust. Thomas shined his lantern across the floorboards and saw similar patterns leading toward a stairwell, descending into darkness. "The basement," Thomas murmured. "That's where they kept the subjects. That's where we'll see everything." As they descended, a sudden coldness enveloped them. The temperature dropped sharply, and their lantern flames flickered violently, as if struggling against some unseen force. Thomas felt a prickle along his spine, the unmistakable sensation that they were no longer alone. "Thomas, look." Marie pointed to the walls. Shadows moved independently of the lantern light, stretching and twisting in ways that defied physics. They were elongated, malformed, and somehow sentient. A silent warning, or perhaps an invitation. The basement opened into a large subterranean chamber, the air thick with the smell of decay and the faint tang of chemicals. Rusted cages lined the walls, some overturned, some still bolted shut. Stalactites of mineral deposits had formed along the ceiling, dripping steadily into shallow puddles on the floor. Among the debris, remnants of medical instruments gleamed dully, some still stained with the dark residue of past experiments. Thomas moved closer to a large wooden table in the center. Upon it lay papers, journals, and diagrams, a perfect record of the atrocities conducted here, preserved as if by the hands of fate itself. The notes described injections, chemical treatments, surgical manipulations, and psychological experiments. But as Thomas read, the air shifted. A subtle vibration, like a low hum, began to resonate through the floor. Marie grabbed his arm. "Thomas, do you hear that?" The sound grew, a rhythmic, almost liquid movement. The puddles along the floor began to ripple, and then, with a sudden splash that made them both jump, shapes emerged. Figures, malformed yet unmistakably human, rose slowly from the water pooled across the stone floor. 7 of them, their bodies twisted by decades-old experimentation, their features distorted but their eyes glinting with recognition. They were the echoes of the victims, preserved not in death but in a liminal state, somewhere between flesh and spirit. Thomas's throat went dry. He had read the accounts, seen the records, but he had not anticipated this. Not the tangible presence of suffering made manifest. One of the figures stepped forward, taller than the rest, its movements deliberate, its gaze fixed on Thomas. The shape spoke, a voice like water over gravel, distorted yet intelligible. You are the one who carries the blood." Thomas swallowed. I am Thomas Whitmore. I am here to help, to bear witness." The figure's eyes softened slightly. "Witness, yes. That is all we ever wanted, witness. Not pity, not vengeance, just recognition." Marie stepped forward, holding her lantern higher. "We are here to understand, to make sure the world knows, to give you peace." The figures shifted, their forms flickering in and out of solidity. One by one they began to recount their stories. The first described the day he had been promised work at the mill, the kindness of a foreman who had greeted him with a handshake and a smile. The subsequent confinement, the injections, the chemical baths, and the experiments, designed to alter not only his body, but his perception of reality. Another recounted how her screams were ignored, how she had witnessed others die slowly, and how the walls themselves seemed to absorb the sound, holding it captive for eternity. Each testimony was a blend of pain, endurance, and a plea for acknowledgement. They did not seek revenge, they sought recognition. The simple acknowledgement that their suffering had meaning, and that the crimes committed against them would not be forgotten. Thomas and Marie listened for hours, documenting every word, every movement. The figures described the techniques used, the sequence of events, the deliberate planning of their captors. Men and women who saw themselves as scientists, but who had abandoned all sense of morality. Each story was more harrowing than the last, and the weight of history pressed down on Thomas's shoulders. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the boarded windows, the figures faded back into the shadows of the basement, leaving Thomas and Marie alone among the remnants of human cruelty. The hum of the unseen energy dissipated, and the puddles of water stilled, but the impact of their presence lingered, etched into Thomas's mind like the journals on the table. We have to continue," Thomas said, voice barely above a whisper. "This is only one site. There are more. And these victims. They deserve to be remembered, to be acknowledged by the living." Marie nodded, her face pale but resolute. "And we will. Every site, every story, every life will bear witness. We'll make sure history remembers." Before leaving, Thomas placed a small marker near the stairwell. A simple inscription on a slate tile he had brought from Boston. Here suffering was endured. Here we remember. They exited the mill into the cold morning air, the sun rising behind the skeletal remains of the building. Though exhausted and shaken, a sense of purpose burned brighter than ever. They had seen the first manifestation of the victims, the liminal echoes of the past, and they understood now the true scope of their mission. The covenant of witnesses, though not yet formally formed, was already taking shape in their hearts, a commitment to uncover hidden atrocities, honor the dead, and prevent future horrors. The journey south from Boston to Louisiana was long and quiet. Thomas and Marie rode in a modest carriage, the landscape shifting from rolling New England hills to the humid, moss-draped swamps of the bayou. The air grew heavier with each mile, thick with the scent of water and earth, and as they neared New Orleans, the oppressive humidity pressed against their lungs, a constant reminder that the land itself could bear memory, just as the mill had. "This place feels different," Marie whispered as they passed through a narrow wooden bridge spanning a sluggish river. Her hand tightened around Thomas's. "Even from here, I can sense it. The weight of what happened. It hasn't left." Thomas nodded, staring out at the water, where the reflection of hanging cypress trees shimmered in the late afternoon light. "We've prepared for this. We've documented, alerted the bishop, and Father Russo is already ahead of us. We're not walking into this blind." Yet no preparation could truly ready them for the presence of Ravencrest Mansion. From a distance, the plantation house seemed almost normal, a relic of antebellum grandeur, its white columns partially obscured by overgrown ivy. But as they approached, the air seemed to thicken, heavy and stagnant. Even in daylight, the shadows clinging to the walls were unnaturally dark. The bayou whispered around them, the sound of water moving over roots and mud like faint, mocking laughter. Sheriff Lauren's deputies were stationed at the entrance, their muskets slung but eyes sharp, scanning the surrounding foliage. They stepped aside to allow the carriage through, but their unease was palpable. Even men accustomed to crime and violence had sensed the darkness that lingered here. Thomas dismounted first, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil of the clearing in front of the mansion. The front steps were cracked and uneven, warped by years of neglect and the subtle expansion of the swampy earth beneath them. He could see it immediately. The evidence of past atrocities embedded in the very bones of the house. Faint stains, almost imperceptible, traced across the stone leading toward the cellar entrance. And above it all, the air seemed to hum faintly, a vibration that set nerves on edge and made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Father Russo arrived shortly after them, his small satchel slung over one shoulder. The priest had a serene confidence about him, though Thomas noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. The toll of dealing with human corruption and suffering was never negligible, even for a man of faith. "We will enter together," Father Russo said quietly. "Step lightly. Speak only when necessary. Whatever resides here, it will respond to presence, to intent. Show it respect, and it may show itself fully. Show fear, and you may invite it into your mind." Thomas glanced at Marie, who nodded. She carried her lantern high, but her grip was steady. Together they stepped forward, the creaking of the wooden floor underfoot echoing like a drumbeat in the still afternoon. The dining room was first. Its walls were lined with scrawled confessions, desperate handwriting spiraling across wallpaper and wood. They paused, allowing the priest to step forward and read silently. His lips moved in soft murmurs, prayers or blessings, perhaps both. Thomas felt a chill run through him. These were not just words, but echoes of pain, captured and preserved by the walls themselves. "This room," Father Russo said finally, turning to Thomas, "absorbs suffering. Not supernatural, not in the sense of demons, but spiritually. Every act of violence leaves an imprint. Every scream, every tear, every act of cruelty, it accumulates." Thomas swallowed, his mind flashing back to the mill, to the 7 figures rising from the water. Could this house harbor such echoes, multiplied over decades? Could Cornelius Ravenrest's family have been ensnared in the very horrors he orchestrated, his victim's anguish spreading like ink across the pages of the world? They moved toward the basement door, which had been sealed by decades of neglect. Father Russo paused, making the sign of the cross, then pushed it open. The air that greeted them was fetid, thick with the smell of decay and chemicals. Shadows clung to the corners, and water pooled across the floor, reflecting the flickering lantern light in distorted patterns. Thomas's boots sank slightly into the soft, damp earth. He held his lantern high, illuminating the cages, workbenches, and instruments that had once been used for experimentation. Every item was a testament to human cruelty, every surface a canvas for suffering. The journals lay strewn across a table, open to pages of notes detailing Cornelius Ravenrest's experiments, each more horrific than the last. Then the water moved, slowly at first, a gentle ripple, but growing steadily. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. 7 shapes rose, exactly as they had in the mill. But now, in the basement of Ravencrest Mansion, the figures carried the weight of decades of injustice, and their presence was more commanding, more urgent. Samuel Beaumont stepped forward first, his eyes locking on Thomas. "You came," he said, voice resonant, calm but carrying a hint of sorrow. You have come to bear witness as promised." The other 6 figures spread around the basement, their forms flickering between translucence and near-solid flesh. They recounted their ordeal in chilling detail. The poisonings, the surgical manipulations, the psychological torment, the slow and deliberate dismantling of their identities. But unlike the mill victims, these stories included the betrayal of kin, the twisted logic of Cornelius's own family, and the final acts of desperation that led to his demise. Thomas and Marie listened, documenting every word. They recorded the echoes of the past, the voices of the victims, and the energy that seemed to pulse through the basement itself. Every story reinforced the enormity of the task before them: to cleanse the house, to honor the victims, and to prevent the legacy of the Ravencrest family from continuing. Father Russo moved among the figures, speaking softly, offering words of comfort, prayers of absolution. He knelt beside Samuel, his hand hovering over the spirit's shoulder. "You are heard," he whispered. "Your suffering is recognized. You may find peace." The figures flickered, their tension easing slightly. The air, once heavy and suffocating, felt lighter. Thomas realized that the victim's anguish had power, not to harm, but to demand justice. And now that justice was being acknowledged, that power could finally be released. Thomas stepped forward, voice steady. "We will burn the mansion. We will consecrate the ground. Your suffering will not be forgotten, and this place will no longer hold darkness." Samuel inclined his head. "Then it is done. Let our stories be carried forward. Let the living remember and let the dead rest." Preparations began immediately. The bishop's directives were followed meticulously. Priests walked every room, performing rites of purification. The skeletal remains in the basement were recovered and given proper Catholic burial. The town gathered at a safe distance as the mansion was set ablaze, the flames consuming wood, fabric, and paper, reducing decades of human cruelty to ash. But as the fire reached its zenith, Thomas and Marie witnessed something extraordinary. From the ruins, the 7 figures rose, restored to their human forms, their faces serene and whole. They hovered briefly, a final acknowledgement of gratitude passing between them and Marie. A silent farewell to Thomas. Then they ascended, dissolving into the smoke and the sky, leaving only the warmth of the sunlit flames and the smell of cleansing ash behind. Thomas knelt in the scorched earth, placing a small marker at the foundation's edge. Here stood darkness. Here now stands remembrance. May those who suffered find eternal peace. Marie planted a live oak nearby, a symbol of endurance and hope. Over time, wildflowers covered the cleared land, reclaiming it from decay, a testament to life's resilience against cruelty. As they departed Louisiana, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle on him once more. Father Russo's words echoed in his mind. The Ravencrest Mansion might be gone, but the network of corruption, the legacy of unethical research could extend further. Somewhere others might still suffer, and somewhere else darkness waited to be confronted. Their work had only begun. After leaving Louisiana, Thomas returned to Boston, carrying a packet of documents that would change his life forever. Letters, journals, and reports compiled over decades by church investigators, detailed not only his great-grandfather's experiments but a hidden network of researchers who had shared similar obsessions. The thought that the horrors of Ravencrest Mansion were merely a branch of a deeper, older tradition gnawed at him. Somewhere in the vast landscape of North America, there might still be other laboratories, where human lives were treated as experiments, as tools for twisted ambition. Marie traveled with him, their partnership solidified by the harrowing experiences at Ravencrest. Where Thomas carried methodical curiosity and a historian's mind, Marie brought empathy and intuition. She had the rare ability to reach the families of victims, to coax stories from those long buried under fear or shame, and to give these stories the dignity they deserved. Together they were no longer just 2 people trying to right the wrongs of the past. They were a force of accountability and remembrance. Their first stop after Boston was New York, where Thomas had located records of a sanitarium that had operated under the guise of legitimate medical treatment. From 1825 to 1840, the facility had housed countless patients who were subjected to invasive experiments disguised as psychiatric therapies. The descendants of the staff were hesitant to speak, but Thomas and Marie's delicate persistence gradually revealed fragments of truth. They uncovered diaries, letters, and faded photographs, each telling the story of lives interrupted, altered, and in some cases, destroyed entirely. As they documented these discoveries, Thomas realized that a pattern was emerging. Wherever there had been secrecy, privilege, or scientific ambition unchecked by ethics, human suffering had followed. The practices of his great-grandfather were neither isolated nor unique. They were symptomatic of a broader, enduring threat. The urgency of their mission became clear. They could not stop at uncovering one laboratory or one victim. They had to pursue the entire network, document it, and bring it into the light. In Boston, Thomas met with Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, his mother's old friend, who had intimate knowledge of the family history. She confirmed what Father Russo had suggested. The experiments had roots that extended far beyond the Whitmore family. Many early researchers corresponded under pseudonyms, and some had even fled overseas, carrying their knowledge with them. Dr. Thornton provided maps, letters, and cross-references, giving Thomas and Marie a starting point to trace the web of hidden laboratories. Soon they had a vision, a network of investigators, researchers, and concerned citizens dedicated to uncovering these hidden crimes, bearing witness to the victims, and preventing future atrocities. They called themselves the Covenant of Witnesses, an informal coalition that acknowledged the weight of history while actively working to prevent its repetition. The covenant was grounded in meticulous documentation, moral accountability, and collaboration with both law enforcement and the church. Their work was painstaking and often dangerous. In Vermont, they found an abandoned mill where Irish immigrants had been experimented upon in the 1810s. Local church officials had sealed the building decades prior, but whispers of missing relatives persisted. Thomas carefully cataloged the remnants, recording testimony from elderly descendants who had heard stories passed down through generations. Every cage, every instrument, every faint trace of blood told a story that demanded recognition. Upstate New York brought them to the sanitarium run by Ambrose Sinclair, a researcher far more sophisticated than Cornelius Ravencrest. Sinclair had disguised his experiments as legitimate treatments for mental illness, preying upon those with no voice or power. By the time authorities suspected wrongdoing, Sinclair had fled west, leaving behind dozens of victims whose fates were never fully determined. Thomas and Marie documented the remaining evidence, working with local clergy to consecrate the property and establish a memorial for the victims. As their reputation grew, more families came forward. Letters arrived from Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and even as far west as Ohio. These correspondents told stories of disappearances, strange illnesses, and suspicious deaths that were linked to the shadowy network of researchers. Each case presented new challenges, legal obstacles, resistant locals, and the emotional weight of revisiting trauma. But Thomas and Marie persevered. Over time, the Covenant of Witnesses expanded. Young historians, forensic researchers, and clergy joined the cause. They trained others to investigate ethically, document accurately, and bear witness without succumbing to fear or despair. Conferences were held, reports compiled, and networks established to coordinate efforts across state lines. While Thomas and Marie often led the investigations, they were careful to cultivate leadership and initiative among younger members, ensuring the covenant would endure beyond their lifetimes. Through it all, Thomas carried the lessons of Ravencrest Mansion. He knew that confronting evil required more than physical evidence. It demanded recognition of suffering, moral courage, and the willingness to act when others might look away. The spirits of the victims, Samuel Beaumont and the others, haunted his memory not as apparitions to fear, but as a reminder of responsibility. They had been silenced in life, transformed into something horrific, and finally, through witness and justice, they had found peace. 2 years after the burning of Ravencrest Mansion, Father Russo sent a letter that both alarmed and galvanized Thomas. It contained a 1802 letter from his great-grandfather, suggesting that the research had not originated with the Whitmore family at all. There were hints of an older tradition, possibly stretching back to colonial times, of unethical experimentation hidden beneath the veneer of scientific pursuit. The revelation was chilling. Ravencrest Mansion was not the root of the problem, only a branch on a much larger tree. This understanding transformed the Covenant's mission from reactive to proactive. Thomas began traveling farther, sometimes accompanied by Marie, sometimes with trusted members of the Covenant, to uncover laboratories, houses, and institutions where dark experiments might have occurred. They encountered more than just physical evidence. They found families scarred by hidden histories, communities that had normalized silence, and legacies of violence that required careful unraveling. Each site revealed more about the practices and mindsets that allowed these atrocities to persist. Researchers had relied on secrecy, legal loopholes, and social hierarchies to protect themselves. Some descendants had inherited the knowledge, continuing experiments in isolation. Others had destroyed records, leaving only whispers and fragmented evidence. The Covenant's role became one of reconstruction, piecing together stories, documenting injustices, and ensuring that history could neither repeat nor be forgotten. Despite the overwhelming scale of the work, there were moments of profound hope. Families received closure, graves were marked, and communities began to reconcile with hidden pasts. In Vermont, an Irish immigrant family discovered letters describing what had happened to their ancestors. In New York, descendants of the sanitarium's victims finally received acknowledgement of their suffering. Each act of witness was a small victory against the shadow that had stretched over decades. As the years passed, Thomas aged, and Marie remained a steadfast partner. Together, they cultivated not only knowledge and documentation, but also a philosophy. Evil may endure, but witness endures longer. A life dedicated to remembering, documenting, and protecting was a life that countered darkness in tangible ways. They formalized the covenant, establishing protocols for investigation, documentation, and spiritual care for those involved. One spring, nearly a decade after their first return to Louisiana, Thomas and Marie returned to the site of Ravencrest Mansion. The oak tree they had planted had grown tall and strong, surrounded by a field of wildflowers that seemed to dance in the wind. Children from the nearby town played in the clearing, unaware of the ground's violent past. Thomas knelt beside the tree, placing a small plaque that read, "Here stood darkness. Here now stands remembrance. May those who suffered find eternal peace." Marie smiled beside him, brushing her fingers through the soil. "Life has a way of reclaiming even the worst of places," she said softly. "Goodness always finds a way to grow, even after the darkest night." Thomas nodded, watching the children run through the clearing. He felt the presence of Samuel and the other 6 victims, their faces serene, acknowledging that their suffering had not been in vain. For the first time, he truly understood the magnitude of the Covenant's work. It was not just about uncovering atrocities, but ensuring that every act of suffering was remembered, honored, and transformed into a catalyst for justice and compassion. Years later, when Thomas was an old man, the Covenant had grown into a respected organization with chapters across the country. It continued to investigate, document, and bear witness, creating memorials, consecrating contaminated sites, and advocating for laws protecting vulnerable populations. Marie and Thomas had trained a new generation of investigators, instilling in them the principles that guided the Covenant: courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to truth. As Thomas sat beneath the oak tree for the last time, he reflected on the journey that had begun with Ravencrest Mansion. Darkness had existed, yes, and it had caused unimaginable suffering, but light had endured too. Witness had endured, and through that witness, the victims' voices had finally been heard. The Covenant of Witnesses, born from tragedy, had become a beacon, a living testament to the belief that even in the face of human cruelty, justice, memory, and compassion could prevail. The last thing Thomas saw before closing his eyes was 7 figures standing beneath the oak tree, restored and free, smiling down at him. They faded into the evening light, leaving behind a world made better by the courage of those willing to remember, to act, and to bear witness.